Alrighty. Well, so you're there in Australia, right? You just
Yeah,
moved to an
welcome.
Airbnb. Yeah, I know, right? So you were in a hotel for the tournament, and you switched over to Airbnb because sadly the guys lost in the semis,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Technically, we were in an Airbnb and we booked it like through the semis and we failed to book through the final.
Oh, okay. That's
So we went from one Airbnb to another one.
yeah, alrighty. So I mean, for context, I mean, you were working and traveling there with Sam and Dre, and I want to make sure
Yeah.
that I get the pronunciation of after hearing the commentators butcher Sam's name, especially his last name, all week. It's Verbeek, right? Is the right way to say that?
It's so if I butcher it, I mean my American's gonna be even worse than the Australian. But imagine baking and
Mm-hmm.
it's more like verbake.
Verbeek. Okay.
The Dutch flow is a little different. It's a little off, but if typical English speakers just say Sam Verbeek, then it's
Right. That's close
pretty
enough.
good. Yeah,
Well, it's
yeah,
funny.
they won't complain.
I got chastised the other day for one of the videos I put up about Gael fees, and was criticized by a gentleman named Joe for my pronunciation of
Of Gale.
Monfils' last name. Uh, and
Tough.
given that I don't speak any French whatsoever or any of the Romance languages, I thought it was a little rich coming from Joe. But
French
you
would
know,
be my absolute worst pronounce. Well, I mean, besides like Chinese or something, but French would be real bad on the romance side. But we need to cover some like Japanese players, and just let you shine. I feel
I
like
know, right? Well, not these days.
that's
The Japanese was a little rusty in 2025. I don't get a lot of opportunity to practice conversational Japanese. Although, funnily enough, I remember at the Atlanta Open when we had the practice
rip.
session with Nishikori, and
Yeah.
how funny it is that he acts like he doesn't know how to speak English most of the time.
You know what was so funny to me was when you said like I don't know, like hey, what's up or something to him in passing, and then you stopped and you're like, wait, I gotta say more than like two words so he knows that I actually know Japanese instead of just like oh konnichiwa or dude, I don't know anything. He's like
Yeah,
you awful. But then
funny
you guys like
times.
had a conversation. It was so funny, and like the look on his face was like, oh my gosh, like this
Yeah.
random guy in Atlanta just knows Japanese.
Well, I think
So
I always get that reaction, right? I mean, people don't expect this 6'2" white guy to suddenly bust out with possible
probably not.
Japanese in
Probably not.
conversation. But so you were there with Sem Verbeek and Verbeek. Sorry, I did it right there. Uh, it's
Yes.
early here. Sem Verbeek and Andre Goranson,
Yeah. I
and
mean, are we not gonna do Andre Göransson's name? Like, are we gonna go for the Swedish? Because every day I try and get it, and every day he makes fun of me.
I honestly didn't even know where to start trying. So is it a
Yeah.
silent adjacent G Joransson? Is that
Göransson. I'm gonna
okay?
butcher it. I know there's
I'll do my
umlauts
best.
involved. There's accents. It's like we can't even write it the right way. So, uh,
And
we
that's
just call him
a reflection
Dre.
on us. But yeah, so Dre and Sam, and yeah, I found something really fascinating. Um, that they're going to come out of this whole tournament. They made the semis. They beat number one team in the world, right? Lost to the
That
three
was fun.
seeds in three sets in the
Yeah.
semis. And at the end of all of this, if I'm remembering rightly, so Sam's going to end up ranked 40th in the world in doubles, and
Yeah,
Dre's
on
is going to
Monday.
be 48 on Monday.
Yep.
And these are two guys like Sam's highest ranking. They both played Division One college tennis,
Yes.
right? Sam was at the University
For
of
four
Pacific
years.
for 4 years. So Sam was at University of
Yeah.
Pacific, and Dre was at California.
Cal. Yep.
Yep.
Cal Berkeley.
So Sam's highest ranking in college tennis was 40,
In doubles,
and
not
in
even in
doubles,
singles.
his highest ranking in college tennis and doubles was 40, and Dre's I think was somewhere in the 70s.
In doubles, though, in
In doubles,
singles,
Dre was
Dre
pretty
got to number
strong.
3
Right, that was his best. But
one season.
so
Yeah.
that's their best college rankings,
Yeah.
and now so Sam's gone from peaking out at 40 in the country in college tennis to 40 in the world And I
That's right.
don't think we see a lot of people make a transition like that. And
Yeah.
I thought there was something really interesting. I mean, we talked very briefly. What for me was last night in that, so Dre, obviously you've been working with Sam for years now,
Yeah.
and Dre for not very long.
Well, you have too. I mean, we've both
Well,
worked with
sure,
them
I
plenty.
know, but I mean, like you've been like
Sure.
actively
I'm
traveling with
traveling on the
him,
road.
yeah,
That's
and
fine.
and
Yeah.
and you're his main coach, and Dre, but Dre's kind of only just joined the team in a sense for a little while now. Like Dre and Sam were playing together, but you weren't coaching Dre, and then Dre said, "Sure, let's work together," and
Yeah. We, so we did a little bit of stuff, I guess like 5 years ago. And so we became friends through that
right,
time. And so it's been a very light touch over that time, right? Like he had his own main coach and
sure. So
he
just
worked
maybe a
with
conversation
other
here or there, yeah,
teams.
that
Yeah,
makes
it
sense.
wasn't like shaping the development the way we do if we work with someone really closely.
Right. And so this was your first real stretch working directly with both of them, which I think that's an interesting thing too to me, right? Like this happens
Yeah,
a moderate to mild to maybe a lot on the pro tour where you get these because the doubles pairings can be a little fluid, right? Like guys can swap partners here and there and play
all
with
the time.
somebody for 2 weeks and then they don't really like that matchup or the schedules don't mesh because one of them's still trying to make a run at singles and the other one's a double specialist and so
Yeah,
this guy's going this part of the world and the other guy's going there and so they find a new partner for the week and but even of the steady pairing, sometimes you'll get one of the players is getting coached by one person, another player is getting coached by another person.
yeah,
And I mean, you and I both coached college tennis, where you you're coaching all of the doubles teams functionally, and you're
yeah,
even
that's right.
deciding who's going to play together. And I just think about how hard it must be to coach one half of a doubles pairing, right?
Man,
Because
I don't envy a lot of my friends, that's for sure.
yeah, so I just feel like when I was coaching doubles in college, I always had a very clear vision of what I wanted out of a team,
Yeah, you got to coach
right?
the team
Exactly. So
and not just coach, oh, let's hope the other guy is professional.
yeah, and it gives you, and I think also the relationship is a bit different with a college team, if you're a college coach, and obviously there's always going to be a degree of collaboration, but
Sure.
there's also a way in which I mean you're the head coach and you hold a little more authority with the players, I think, in a lot of ways than what happens on the pro tour.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think in general, a lot of those players give that authority in college. That's actually something that I think is really interesting that we see on the pro tour. A lot of the pro players, this is a gross generalization, of course, but a lot of them, I'm not trying to put a number on it, have told me that they just don't give that authority to other people. They
Sure.
have so much ownership over their own game. I mean, actually, like when we started this, Ben Shelton was still in the middle of a third set against Yannick Sinner,
Hmm.
and Ben's father is the wonderful guy who used to coach at Georgia Tech.
Right.
And he was just telling me yesterday, like, yeah, like Ben jokes around all the time because in practice he'll say like, "Hey, coach, what should I do?" Because his dad is coaching him,
Sure.
and he'll say, "I'll give him my opinion," and then he'll just laugh and be like, "Nah, I'm not doing that, man." And then he'll go out and do something completely different and turn and look at him and say, "Hey, look, I was right and you were wrong." And it's we were getting kind of a kick out of it, but like the point is that kind of extreme ownership is something that we see a lot on the pro tour where it's like, I'm not even going to listen to my coach, even if I'm paying the guy.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And that's very different from the college dynamic for the most part. Right. And I think especially the experiences that you and I
Yeah.
had coaching college tennis where, that authority was implicit in the environment in a lot of ways. And the players that we worked with, at least, from my experience, I mean, of course you always had that player who just wouldn't listen or, by and large was challenging to coach. But for the most part, there was that the power dynamic is different in a lot of ways, and kind of
Yeah.
the feeling or the relationship was very different. And with pro guys, they like you said, they have more ownership. They can be, um, more independent in that regard, which can be a beautiful thing, but
Yeah.
also can be challenging. But now when you're dealing with, I'm working with one guy, and I think like Sam's obviously a joy to work with. Um, but I'm working with one guy, but then he's playing doubles with this other guy who I have a good relationship with, but who I'm not actively coaching. That's
Yeah.
really hard because you don't get to just shape a doubles pairing in a way that you might, like from your college experience. Um,
Well, yeah, I mean, that was really interesting for us because we knew we wanted to play with Andre. When we started, though, the agreement was between Andre and Sam. It wasn't between Andre and myself.
right,
And very explicitly, one of Andre's number one priorities was team decisions will be made by Andre and Sam. They will be made by the players. They will not be made by outside coaches.
right. We almost have
And
to do that, right? I mean, if you're getting coached by different people, there's
yeah,
a way in
well,
which that makes perfect sense.
so you can imagine when we started, Sam was like, "Hey, like I want you to work with my coach because like look at all the things that I've improved, and I know that this is going to help you." But coming in from the outside and not having that personal experience himself, uh, I mean, Dre was in a situation where it was like, "Yeah, like." Yeah, I'm not making any promises towards that. I just know that these are the right two guys to play together, and they knew they wanted to play together.
Yeah,
So
I got to cut in for 1 second because I think there's an interesting question there as well. In that Dre was the better player in college by a
oh yeah, by
notable
far,
by a notable
by
margin.
far.
I was just gonna like underplay that a little bit,
No, I mean,
but I mean,
but I mean, his team was completely better. I mean, he's on a top five team. He's top five in the
right,
country. He won
sure,
like national indoors. He beat multiple guys that end up being top
right,
100.
yeah,
Like
yeah. So,
completely
but I mean,
different level from yeah.
from Sam, yeah. So, do do they carry? Because I look, I know in a lot of college teams, like there's a lot of, and this just happens with people in sports in general, right? That the the better performing athlete, there's an inherent authority that they carry as a result of being. I mean, I think that sometimes you see somebody who's very charismatic and a great leader can kind of accrue a degree of authority with their peers who are better than them. But there's very much in men's sports, I think often this hierarchical way of kind of approaching these
Sure.
relationships where the better the athlete, the more authority they have on a team. Is there any degree of that you think that when they send, and it's totally fine if you don't feel comfortable diving into this, but where maybe Dre felt an inherent little bit of kind of authority because he was the much better player than Sam in college. It's not like they wouldn't know that to a
Well,
degree, right?
it's not just that he was a better player in college, but it's also that he had a higher career high ranking on the ATP. He was
Right,
ranked higher at the time when we started. He had won an ATP title where Sam had not won an ATP title yet. He had made the quarterfinals at Wimbledon where Sam hadn't even played a slam. I
right,
mean, so he had achieved some milestones that are realistically a big deal for people.
sure,
Um, and so there was a certain authority that came from that. And that's where we had to just take a bit of a backseat and say, okay, we just trust in our evaluation of this person. You know, Sam was very explicit to me. Like he said, like, okay, well, we're going to start working together and playing. And even though explicitly we're saying, hey, like, we're not going to be coaching together, he just said, look, I know this guy. I know how much he wants to get better. He's just not making any promises, but he's going to do whatever it takes to get better. And so once he sees what we're doing, he's going to want in, right? Like
right,
great players want to do great work. Great players want great coaches. But you have to prove that. So he
sure.
just, I mean, to us, it was like, well, he's just not going to like sign up for somebody because you like him.
Right.
It's like,
Yeah,
I'll sign up for somebody when I know that they know what they're doing.
sure. And I guess there's an inherent efficiency there too, because you're traveling together, and the idea of getting on board with the same coach, working with a team together, where everybody's driving in the same direction. I mean, obviously, I think there's a lot of power to that. So
Yeah.
they make the semis, and obviously great run, career high rankings coming up. I think one of the interesting things we touched on briefly yesterday was this idea of kind of alignment between kind of somebody's natural, inherent, I'm sort of right way to phrase this, kind of their drive to play a certain way, or their emotional drive to play a certain way. I mean, we've talked before
Yeah.
about like risk tolerance, right?
Right.
Um, the place that it has in how we make decisions tactically and strategically, developmentally as a player. And I think over the years, I know that you've had this experience too. We run into these players that have an emotional drive to play tennis in a way that is completely misaligned with the tools that they bring to the
Mm.
table. And I'm not talking from a
Yeah.
skill perspective. I'm not talking about somebody who thinks they're really, really good when they're not. I'm talking about somebody who has this emotional drive to play a hyper aggressive tennis and come forward to the net, and they're 5'9", and they don't have a ton of
Know how to
power,
volley.
and their volleys are just okay, right? Like, I mean, their volleys aren't the strong.
Yeah.
Like somebody has this drive to come to the net all the time, and their volleys aren't the best part of their game.
Right.
Where we're pushing towards a style of play that doesn't match up with the tools, and how we
How much do you
navigate
think of
that.
that as just? How much do you think of that as just? Does their identity as a player match like their personality?
Well, I think a lot of the identity of a player. Well, so this is where it gets interesting, right? Because I don't think about it as personality per se. In a
Mhm.
sense. I mean, I look at this stuff as a lot of it being driven by a lot of childhood experiences and kind of these formative
Okay.
experiences where people end up with this. So I think partly about how people react to errors versus winners, right? Um,
Okay.
we get the people who are very, very risk averse,
Right.
who have a very low tolerance for making mistakes, right? And
Sure.
those players tend to do very well playing more defensive tennis, where they are very much streamlined and not making
Right.
mistakes, and uh, you know, kind of playing in that style where it kind of matches their emotional state in a lot of ways, or their emotional driver, or what makes them
Right.
feel comfortable emotionally on the court. I mean, like I think about our friend Brian, right? So we both used to play a lot of tennis with a friend of ours, Brian, who that man didn't care if he hit a winner for the next 10 years, but he did
No,
not want
he
to make
just
a
wanted to
mistake.
win.
And
No.
well, that's the
Yeah.
thing is, I don't even know that he wanted to win as much as he wanted to not make a mistake. He was
Well,
perfectly
no, for sure. He
comfortable.
wanted to avoid mistakes more than he wanted to win.
Yeah, if you
Yeah,
hit a
for sure.
great shot winner on him and he played a good point, he was perfectly happy, like
Yeah.
perfectly happy.
No
And
problem. He just said, "Oh, great,
yeah,
great shot."
and I think that's he was kind of an extreme in that way, because he's a
Right.
very calm guy and he's a pediatric heart surgeon. So I think you probably are going to do better in that world if you're not, very reactive and emotional, and able to
Yeah.
stay calm in difficult moments. But he, I think was had a capacity and a tolerance for things, and an ability to kind of stay patient that's beyond the average human, by
Yeah.
a good chunk, I think. But then I think about other players who just can't help themselves with their need to be aggressive. And so I've coached a guy here in Atlanta who, I've literally heard him berate himself for not playing aggressively enough, right? And but having won a point, and
Like he
I'm
won the point, and he's like,
and
"Oh
he's like,
man,
well,
not aggressive enough."
or winning a match, and to paraphrase, to be such a pansy, and didn't use the word pansy, uh and
Yeah.
it's like, well, but wait, you're playing good tennis, what are you worried about,
Right.
right? But
What's the problem? Yeah.
he's playing good tennis, winning the match, but the emotional drive he has to be aggressive on the tennis court with his style of play was more important, even though he will sit there and look you in the face and say, yeah, I want to play good tennis, I want to win matches. And it's like, well, you're achieving your goal right now and you're upset about it, right? Because there's certain markers that you're not hitting that are in your head about what this actually looks like, or kind of the player that you want to be, right?
So this is fascinating. I'm really curious to know how you perceived me back in the day, because I would say I think it was more important for me emotionally to play in alignment with my my drive. Like I needed to play a certain way, I think was more important than actually winning.
Yeah. So what?
Like I didn't like losing, but
Right.
I think but I would literally like Brian actually was one of the people who would tell me like, hey, instead of playing your aggressive style, because like you kind of suck at it, which I mean he just told me, but I mean that was what he said back then. But he was
Yeah.
like, if you just use your fitness and just make balls like me, I could never beat you.
Right.
And I was like, yeah, but that's completely unacceptable to me.
Well, yeah, and I think about your tennis back then, and if you don't mind my saying so, I think there's also like a neurological piece, right? Where I think you really, in a lot of ways, struggle to stay on task in
Oh,
in the course of
totally.
points and shot selections and things. And I think back
No,
to,
I struggled, mate. I struggled to stay on task in between two shots. Okay.
well, I know,
Like
but here's
that's
the
not
thing
a
about,
surprise for
and
me.
this used to drive me nuts. But when we started working together for the first time with our college team, and I was the head coach, you were the assistant coach, so I'm like, hey, I want you to go over and so and so's we've got made this change with this person's backhand. You're going to be there. I just want you to just volley a nice rally ball into their backhand for the next 20 minutes, and I just want them to groove this shot on that tempo
I'm
of a
like the
net
worst
player.
person ever to do that.
Well, you would go over there and you'd put a good volley to them, put a good volley to them, hit a drop volley. And I'm like, they're helping them. Why are you hitting a drop volley? But at the time I didn't understand the neurological piece of it, and I'm just like, what the hell? Like
I
you
couldn't
got
help it.
one job to do, which is to help this player, and you're hitting like, you know,
Couldn't help it.
showboat shots, but you couldn't help it, right?
Couldn't help it. Actually, like
And
actually could not repeat a task, 10 times in a row. Like
right,
in my whole life, that was never happening at that stage. Now, obviously,
right,
I've learned and trained differently
yeah,
since then. But
and kind of like that ADHD driven thing where I know people like to joke, right? Oh, I have ADHD, because I deep clean my closet. It's like, no, 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 no. You don't. I don't think you really understand what we're talking about. For a lot of people, like, what does ADHD actually look like? It looks like that, where I think there's something that you just physically could not hit five volleys in a row to somebody's backhand when that's the one thing that you were supposed to be doing for them. And it's not that
yeah,
you were not a thoughtful coach or that you didn't care about your players. You did. It's not that you were trying to show off. Like there's
no,
that part
not at
where,
all.
and so then you take that and put it in the context of a match. Well, if somebody's got a weak backhand and you can hit five balls in a row to their backhand every rally and just beat the pants off them,
Saw them, yeah.
and and,
But I
and it's
wouldn't
like,
do that.
I know, yeah, you couldn't, right?
I could identify it, like I could see it,
Yeah,
right? I could tell someone else to do it. But like the reality is you could have stood next to me in the practice and said, hey, hit the same ball 10 times to like coach this person. You could have stood next to me with a stick. And if you're like, if you do something different, I'm gonna hit you with a stick. And I just would have been getting hit with the stick. I would have been like, yep, it's fine. Because the urges in my brain, like the brain signals that I'm being sent, were stronger literally than getting physically hit.
right,
Like that's just how it is.
sure.
So the idea of going out and just like I can just make 10 balls in a row high to this guy's backhand and I'm gonna go home and win the match. I can go train and get better. It is like an impossible idea for me. It's like that's for somebody else.
Right.
I saw no way, I had no idea of how to get myself to do that, no matter how much I wanted to do it.
Well, there's players that are the opposite, where there's a comfort for them in hitting 10 backhands in a row cross court, or 100 backhands in a row cross court, or 1,000 backhands in a row cross court, and they're
Yeah,
perfectly happy to do that for 5 hours, right? I mean, that would be our
sure.
friend Brian. Like, he'd 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 happily just hit backhands cross court for an hour,
Oh yeah,
totally fine. No, no
totally.
problem at all. And we're talking about a pediatric heart surgeon. We're not talking about somebody who couldn't hold two thoughts in his head and was just like, well, let me just hit 100 balls cross court, because
No, no, no.
no, I mean, he was a very, very bright man, no matter how much he would underplay his own intelligence. But he just had a tolerance for that that's very high. And I don't think we
Extremely high.
recognize, yeah. And we think about for the average player, do most players you think have a self-awareness of, so we've got these pieces here. So I've got the actual physical tools that I have, in
Yeah.
terms of my body, right? Because I think about like if you're 6'8", 220-pound guy, you're not going to play like Alex Demina.
Grind.
Uh, right. Or if you're 5'9" and 150 pounds, you're not going to play like
Ben
Pericard
Shelton.
or Ben
Yeah.
Shelton. Sorry, Joe, if I said Pericard's name wrong. Uh, and then
I'm pretty sure. Yeah. You better
I probably
send
did.
him a coupon because I
I'll
think we got it wrong.
I know. I'll go ahead and apologize in advance. So you've got that piece of it, right? Like, what's the body that genetics has given me, and
Sure.
how does that align with what I have to do? Then you've got the technique side of things, because it doesn't matter if you're 6'8", if your strokes are I'm just bunting the ball with no spin, you're
Sure.
not going to go out there and beat people off the court. Then we've got the emotional piece. We like my guy that's calling himself a pansy in a match that he's winning because it's not aggressive enough tennis. And then we have this neurological piece, which is how well is my brain able to stay on task,
Right.
which can be a blessing and a curse, because I don't want to put it out there that the ability to hit 10,000 cross-court backhands in a rally in a row and feel perfectly happy with that is ideal, in the same way that not being able to hit 3 backhands in a row cross-court and take advantage of an opponent's weakness is
Right.
ideal. There's kind of this healthy middle ground where it's like I can hit an appropriate number of backhands cross-court and know when the right moment is to go down the line or come into the net or what have you, right?
Well, look, ideally, you can do both.
Right. Ideally, you can do both, but I'm just saying, like the 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 drive to to be on, the drive that comes from being on one extreme or the other. I'm just saying
Yeah.
it's not. I think a lot of people might say, well, it's the player who can just stay on task and hit backhand cross court all day is that's better, but it's not necessarily better,
Superior.
because you might miss
Right.
out on opportunities, or if you have maybe the kind of game where you are the 6'8" guy with massive ground strokes or the big serve and great volleys, that you, that neurological piece isn't necessarily ideal.
Right.
And then how do you put all these things together? And when I think about some of these players that we talk about in the tennis community, and this has been a conversation I think that people have been having for decades, you see these questions come up a lot. Who was the greatest player never to win a Grand Slam?
Mhm.
Who was the best player, the most talented player that never reached their potential? I see these discussion pieces come up online a lot, right? And
Yeah.
I wonder how much of that, for these players like your Monfils and your Marcelo Rioses, and oh goodness, I mean we could go down the list of players we think who probably didn't maybe have results that matched their combination of physical traits and technical traits,
David
and
Nalbandian.
and right, and that gap between those two pieces, which are the obvious ones, right? I mean, we look
Yeah.
at. I mean, Kyrgios is an example too of somebody I think who has these strong
Sure.
emotional drivers that are very self-sabotaging, that don't align well with the way we need to organize our life in order to be a successful professional tennis player. But we
Sure.
see the physical traits, and they're very obvious. I mean, you watch Monfils run around, and it's like, okay, that guy's fast as hell. Uh, you know,
Yeah.
you you
Yeah.
we see some of these athletes, and it's like, okay, this guy's obviously a superior athlete. You see somebody technically, so this guy's obviously, or this girl's obviously a superior technique wise, and we judge what we think players, quote unquote, should achieve in tennis based on those things that we see that are really obvious,
Right.
and then we judge and criticize the ones who underperform because of their emotional and neurological drivers.
We say they underperform.
We say they underperform, and
Yeah.
we're really
Without knowing what
harsh with
else is going on.
we're really harsh with them,
Yeah.
right? I mean,
Yeah.
there are people out there, I think, who almost borderline wish players like Kyrgios harm with the way that they talk about them online, because it's
For
like
sure.
they take it, and I guess there's a piece of this, right? Like if I'm average, you know, Joe back home in Australia, and I'm sitting there working really hard at my 9 to 5 job, and making $70,000 a year. It's easy, I guess, in a way, to sit sit there and get pissed off at someone like Nick who has this rare talent and this kind of capacity, physical capacity to play tennis at a level that's, at a fraction of a percent of the human population is capable of, and has made all this money and got all this fame, and just say, well, come on, mate, don't piss
Right.
that away and take it, but they take it personally.
Yeah,
Um,
they take it personally and they pass a lot of judgments, and they're not
necessarily
actually looking at
understand.
all the information. They
Right. And I look at somebody, the way that somebody like Kyrgios behaves kind of around his tennis, and it's like, well, that's maybe not the most emotionally healthy guy in the world. There's obviously a lot of
Sure.
stuff going on there. Um, because you might say, well, even if he didn't have a strong desire to, maximize his career as a player and maximize his earnings or his ranking or what have you, that's fine. But I think there's a lot of these behaviors that he engages in as an example that don't make his life better in any way, shape, or form, right? And I mean, like
Mhm.
everybody does that to some degree,
Yeah, of course
but
we all do.
there's an extreme to it, and he's not the only player that we've seen do that over the years. And like Monfils been very open; he doesn't really care if he wins this show. I mean, he's making this run at 37. He's doing really well, but he's in interviews being like, "Yeah, I mean, if I win, I win. I'm not really I don't really have any desire to win the tournament." You know,
Yeah, well, he's saying like it's more important now, like for me to have kids and like take care of my family and this kind of stuff. But like,
but there's always
I
something more
think that
important to him. I think, right? It feels to me like I don't think that was
I'm not
ever the
sure.
most important thing in the world to him.
I'm not sure. I mean, Gail's a really interesting one because one of the things that people don't know about Gail is that it's pretty easy to call this guy a genius, not just physically. Like you can
No, he's
look at
very bright.
him, but like, I mean, Gail has other interests. Like he has other hobbies, no exaggeration, other hobbies that he's just as good at as tennis.
Right.
Okay. So, I mean, you got to remember, there's a guy that's like top 10 in the world. Like, only 10 people at a time can say they were top 10 in the world at anything. So it's like, it's almost for sure not whoever's listening. It's
Sure.
almost for sure not whoever's posting about it. Very few top 10 guys. You don't see Roger like chiming in on Instagram going like, "Oh, come on, Gail. Like what a failure." Like no chance, right? Because they understand what they're going through. But how many guys can say that they're that good at two or three things? I
Sure.
mean, that's like unheard of. I mean, you just can't put enough emphasis on that. So, I don't know, but the point is like for me, from the outside, the sort of keyboard warriors online, they they pass judgment on all these guys, whether it's Gale or Curios or now Bandy, and like I was joking beforehand, or anybody, because they have a set of expectations for them. They want to say like, oh, well, I think you have the best serve and the best forehand in the world, so therefore, what you should be number one. You should win a slam. You should win five slams. You should
And
win 15 slams.
you're a
Like,
loser if you don't.
yeah, which is like absolutely bonkers, right? It's like, what like first of all, you have no idea what it takes to win a slam. Like
Right.
you
The
have
margins are so. This is the thing. I think this is like the average person just doesn't get. Like, I think it's one thing, and I say this with zero disrespect to like accountants or engineers. I think it's one thing to be a good engineer or a good accountant, but
right.
when you start talking about I'm going to be the best in the world at this,
It's a
the
completely different thing.
degree of care that it takes, the attention to detail. I think about it like, and you have a background in chess. You played a lot of chess when you were young. As a kid, you played
Yeah.
competitive chess. It's that difference of like, well, I'm a good chess player. I have like a 13 or 1400 ranking, which I don't, but like if I did, that's a
Sure.
strong chess player. The gap between that and like a 1900 level player is night. I mean, it's a chasm. It's the Grand Canyon. And then you think about the gap between like a 1900 level player and like a Magnus Carlsen, and it's like, holy
Another
cow,
canyon.
right? It's
No, it's
another. It's
not.
not even. It's hard, I think, for people to understand because in your day to day life, you don't experience anybody in your life
No,
who
you'll never
is
meet anyone like that.
performing in anything in their life at a
Yeah.
level that puts them in the top fraction of a percent of the world of people doing this thing, right?
Yeah.
It's so incredibly rare that you'd run into. I mean, you have like 7 billion people in the world, right? Like, what are the chances that anybody in your life is, a top 0.1% or top 0.0001%
Yeah.
at any given time? I mean, you think about that, right? Like 0.001%, like that's still 7,000 people or whatever that are doing it at that level. Maybe more, maybe more. Maybe it's like 7 million. I have to sit there and do the math, not off the very, very top of my head here for a moment. But like, you think about what that means to be that good and how rare it would be for kind of just a normal average person living their life to run into anybody who's performing in anything at that level.
Yeah.
And so you don't
It's
have context
crazy.
of what it takes.
I mean, I thought so when I was a young kid, I mean, we're talking 12, 13 years old, like I thought I was pretty good at chess because probably I had some talent for pattern recognition. Um, I was a very bad student. But then I was lucky enough to play against like the youngest master in the world. And I was lucky enough to play against the youngest grandmaster in the world. And the master was, I think, 9 years old.
Yeah.
He was a little Asian kid at the time. And the grandmaster, I know exactly who it was. He was 18 at the time that I played him. He was younger when he first got his grandmaster title. Um, but like these people sacrificed everything else in their life. Like they sacrificed literally everything.
Yeah.
Okay. All they did was study and completely dominate,
And have a
the
natural talent
sport of
for it,
chess.
right? I mean, you talk about people who have a
Yeah.
natural
And
affinity,
they were brilliant. I mean, come on, a 9 year old that is like
muscle level. Yeah.
winning national and international titles, and I mean, it's absurd. And I mean, they're spending just all their resources and all their time. I mean, it's not just their sacrifice, but it's also the family sacrifice and all these things. And at the time, I learned, like, okay, I got my butt kicked by a 9 year old, so like I'm not going to be the best at that. Like that was a
There's
little
some
wake up
work to
call.
do.
And then I got my butt kicked blindfolded by the freaking grandmaster. And it's like great, he not only can he just beat me, but he can beat me with his eyes closed. Like
Literally, right?
that
Not,
put that
so
puts
that's
puts you in
that's
your
somebody.
place.
Well, and you're not joking when you say blindfold. Like they're actually wearing a blindfold and just remembering, and you're saying your moves out
Yeah.
loud, and they're remembering the entire board and where all the pieces are, and making
No,
their moves
literally
verbally.
blindfolded.
Yeah, yeah. No, I
And
just wanted
and
to make sure
and
everybody understood.
and for context, I was at the time in Florida and I think I played the state championships as a kid and I finished third.
Right.
So which was like it was like New York, California, Florida. It was like there were the strongest areas to be in. So I mean I wasn't the best. I know exactly where I fell. If like some chess aficionados are on here, I can tell you what I did and didn't do, right? But like I wasn't like terrible. It's not like I didn't know what I was doing. Like I
Sure.
had
No,
great
you're
coaching.
yeah, you're
I was around
competent.
serious people. And it was just a wake up call for me. There was like, hey, you know what? In this world, I'm not going to be a serious person. I'm not going to be a professional chess player. My heart wasn't in that. That's not what I wanted to do. Ironically, my coach at the time was like always giving me a hard time and pushing me. Like, if you need to actually assert and like dedicate yourself. And I mean, at the time, he's like, okay, well, if it's not going to be chess, like pick something,
Right.
right? But don't be a waste. Um, but the idea of telling a guy who's been like top 20 in the world that you didn't apply yourself is like what do you
You
like?
don't
What are you talking
casually.
about?
Yeah, you don't.
Like you don't
People don't understand.
casually, you
Like
don't accidentally get to top 20.
Nick Kyrgios has put in so much work.
Like literally
Like
more
for
work
all
than
the
almost anyone
persona
else
that
is
he's
ever going to do.
created in public, like he has put in so much work into the game of tennis to reach the level that
Sure,
he has. I mean, it doesn't matter how quote unquote talented you are. I mean, you and I both know how
please.
great some players there are out there just randomly. I mean, like I'm in Atlanta and I mean, I could close my eyes and throw a stick and hit a really, really good tennis player here, like really, really good tennis player who could
Yeah,
probably be anybody listening unless you're, like a professional. And,
yeah, literally.
um, because I mean, Atlanta has such a vibrant, robust tennis community, and that these people wouldn't be anywhere on the ATP rankings, or
The
maybe could earn
guys,
a few points. Like it's
the talent, honestly, that you see fail is mind boggling.
right.
Like fail. but like, but I'm not saying like, oh, they didn't get to top 20. I'm saying they didn't get to top 500.
Right.
Okay, like they never made any money. Like they just lost money on the sport. But like just the physical skills that they have sometimes are like wow, like you could be top 20 physically.
Right. But that gap's there.
But it takes so much more than just the one thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, you see that, and I mean, if you want to break it down even further, it's like the best forehand that I had ever seen until very recently was on a college player
Mm,
who made it to like uh, I don't think he made it top 500,
right.
but like he didn't have the rest of the game to be a full-time successful pro. He worked his butt off, bright guy, no shot tolerance, interestingly enough.
Mm,
Um, but like I saw him go forehand to forehand with some of the biggest like hitters in the game. Like, I mean, huge hitters, okay? And just go right through them. And it was like, wow, like that was crazy. I went on the court with him and hit with that. I couldn't even rally with his forehand,
right.
which is, I mean, I'm rallying with guys top 40 in the world now. And I just literally couldn't rally. I was like, this is absurd.
But you need all those other
It's
pieces.
not enough, man. It's
Yeah.
just not enough. Like just one thing isn't going to get it done because, I mean, we can get to other aspects of your game and that's just how it is. The other irony of that situation is he was maybe my size. Like he wasn't that big. I mean, I'm under 6 foot tall. He was maybe 5'11", maybe 6 foot tall. But
Yeah.
like, it's so the point is like it's not like he had, oh, I'm 6.5 feet tall. I have a huge serve and I have the huge forehand.
Right.
Maybe then the guy's top 20 in the world. But you
It's
give
funny
him
how
a
that
sub
goes,
6 foot
right?
serve,
Yeah.
and it's
And he
like,
doesn't
who
even get a
knows?
tennis career.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, one of the best backhands I've seen is on a guy that was like 5'8" and played in Atlanta for a few years.
Right.
Technically, it's one of the favorite strokes I've ever seen.
Yeah, yeah, it's
Yeah,
funny how that goes, but I mean, that's how small the margins are. And so when we think about people that have like that emotional drive to play in a way that doesn't match up with their tools, or maybe like a neurological tolerance that doesn't align with all the other pieces of their game, and that mismatch doesn't need to be large. That's when we start thinking about professional tennis, the
yeah,
difference between having a career and retiring at 35 and not having to worry about money for the rest of your life if you're not frivolous. I'm not talking like Roger Federer, like screw you money,
right.
but just like, okay, I've got a few $1 million in the bank where I can live well for the rest of my life if I don't go crazy, right? The
Right.
gap between being that person and I grinded at tennis for 20 years and I came out of it with $10,000 in the bank is really
Yeah,
small. It's actually really functionally very, very small, and it
very
can be
small.
as small as just a little gap in that right. Like, okay, so my neurological shot tolerance is just a little short of where it needed to be to match up with all the other pieces of my game, or
Yeah,
my emotional drive to just occasionally hit a hyper aggressive shot, not all the time, not constantly, but just sometimes hit a hyper aggressive shot that didn't align with everything else that was going on. That can be enough to lose matches consistently that stops you from ever breaking through.
well, I'm gonna give you an interesting one here. I don't know if I've actually, I might have talked to you about this like 6 months ago in passing.
Yeah.
And it's a little bit different than say like going with the shot tolerance one. But specifically for this team, one of the guys, this team that we've been talking about that we're working with here in Melbourne, one of the guys had a problem where he didn't hit smashes very well. He would
Hmm.
get lobbed, and he would get lobbed a lot. And uh, the upshot of the story is it put a limiter on how high he could move up the rankings. So
Right.
now he's smashed through that. Now he's got a new career high. Now he's got, he's won ATP titles and made the semis of a slam. And, he's on track to be a top 20 player now. But what's interesting is just a year ago, we took a real hard look at the film and looked at the matches. And we said, okay, well, like, let's pull like some examples of these smashes and look at what's going on. And first we look at the technique and it's like, okay, well, you know, maybe not perfect, but like
Good enough.
no blunders, like it's better than most guys. Like it doesn't explain how are we losing these points so much? How are we getting lobbed? How are you getting lobbed? And you're not able to do it. And we kept looking closer and closer, trying to identify like, okay, what's going on? Because the issue is if you're playing doubles and basically you're losing 75% of the points where you get lobbed, it's like you have a problem that affects other parts of your game because now your
Sure.
net positioning is different. Now you have to play kind of a more defensive style. You have to play back. When you go put a ball away, they know like, well, if I can just throw up a lob, I'm winning 50% of the points instead of losing all of those
Yeah,
points.
it's a game
It's
changer.
a huge, it's a huge swing. So it can be maybe I can win challengers, but now I can't win ATPs. Where, now it's like, oh, well, maybe I can win challengers and maybe I can win slams too. Um, but what we ended up finding was we looked real closely at his neck, and he
Mhm.
just couldn't move his neck up enough to track the lob.
Right, because it's you end up with a different position than you might in a serve, for example, right?
Yeah,
And the serve's so
literally.
repeatable that even maybe you can't quite hit the right neck position,
Well, this
you
the
you know where
serve
the
you
ball's going to be.
control.
Yeah,
You control the serve, so you can compensate for it. So he'd compensate for it on his serve because he has a fairly big serve, right? But what we did was we said, okay, like let's look at this and say like we want to make this investigation basically and see if we work with your neck a little bit and teach you to move your neck in a different position. Can we do it? Now, he had no history of neck problems, no
right.
neck pain. He's like, dude, like, what are you talking about my neck for? Like, I need to work on my smash. And we're like, yeah, we want to do some neck exercises and we think maybe it'll help your smash. Lucky enough, he was willing to try it. So he tries it. His neck movement differs. And literally, like, very soon after, he's going, "Oh, I'm getting back for these smashes a lot more now." Then we were able to actually work on the smash and integrate it a little bit,
Right.
and now he's got one of the best smashes. And just like that, it's like completely changed what he was able to do. Then you mentioned the serve. His serve got better because of it, which he
Right.
never even thought it needed to get better. But it
Sure.
was like, oh, that's a happy consequence. But the point is, it's like here's a guy who is super strong, super fit, worked his butt off, had no injury, nothing to speak of, nothing showing up on a scan. There's no history. There's no car accident. There's nothing weird. But it's just like, yeah, I mean, just this little tiny thing in his neck made it so now, like, I have a completely different ceiling in my game.
And sometimes
And
it's not even like, okay, oh, my neck can't move in a certain way, but you just haven't learned to move. I think about like the way people move physically side to side, and it's funny to me like, okay, it might not be that you have this dysfunctional ankle, but it's that you have so strongly habituated the way that you move your foot in your first step that
yeah,
costs you, 20% of your power in that first step, and that's a game changer for movement, right?
it's
And you have
huge.
to go in and function like learn how to move your ankle a certain way because if you're kind of just a normal, I say normal person, right? But if you people don't train ankle position, they don't train the way their
Yeah,
ankle moves, and so you learn a way of moving your ankle when you're running or whatever when you're a kid. Which
yeah,
what are the odds that that's biomechanically ideal? And then you
not
carry
very
that
high.
into adulthood, and it's going to impact everything that you do on the court, right? It's going to impact the way that you move. You're like, well, I'm fast. Why can't I get to these shots? You know,
Yeah,
and it's like, well, yeah, you're fast when you get going, but those your first two steps are slow, and they're not slow because you're not physically able to accelerate. They're slow because you put your first step, you put your foot in at a weird angle or the way that you land it, and then you're losing a bunch of power, which has follow-on impact for the second step, and then you start to get going, and yes, you're fast, but it's too late
yeah,
at that point. And it might be only in
yeah.
one direction because you might do a fine going to your left but not to your right, or vice versa. um, it's just
Well,
funny how all these things kind of come together.
we never see perfect humans, okay? Like physically perfect
Yeah,
humans. We don't see them. I'm not talking about behavior, but just like we never see physically perfect humans. Like Roger Federer is as close as I've probably ever seen, but like even he has stuff. He can just compensate for it. But what we do see, if you look at top 50 singles and doubles players, men's and women's tours, okay? Like I can tell you for sure, we still see people who struggle to hit like and create power off of one leg versus the other. Like they want to do everything with one leg
right.
because the other one is weak, right? Or they do that with one ankle, where like one ankle is functional in all directions and the other one only has one or two directions, so it's actually functional in. Now, just stop and think for a minute. Like if you're not top 50 in the world, If a top 50 player has that, like seriously, what the hell do you think your local buddy that you're playing with has?
Right. Yeah,
Like,
because there are absolutely
like
players top 50 who have stuff like
we're
that.
yeah, like I tell the people I work with all the time on the tour, like, look, I mean, here we found like two or three things, maybe four or five things that we think we can help you with, and it'll make a big difference in your income because it affects your game that much. But like, I've got more than I can count.
Right.
Like it's crazy. So a lot of people still act when they go and pass judgment on these players, uh like one of my favorite things was when I was young, I passed judgment on players just like anybody else. And it's not until I learned more that I kind of realized that's not an intelligent thing to do. Um, but when I was growing up, I was a big fan of Andy Roddick. Specifically, I was a big fan of his forehand. I was not a fan of his backhand. I couldn't stand it. And my attitude was just like, I mean, I think the guy's like an idiot for not doing something about his backhand. And now I'm like, okay, I was the idiot,
I
like
remember
I
you
was
saying
the
things
idiot.
like that.
Yeah, I didn't know any better, right? It's like I was just sharing my opinion. It was just uninformed, right? It was completely uninformed. Um, but I mean, look, I mean, I said probably worse thing. I mean, not probably. I know I said worse things than that, right? The more that I get into this world, the more I realize, like, wow, like, I mean, I just couldn't have been more wrong. And it's so far from being that easy. Like, I mean, God knows how many backhands Andy Roddick hit. Like, I know he worked on that thing a ton. Like, he hit more backhands than I hit balls in my entire life. He hit more
Okay.
backhands than I did anything in my entire life, probably cumulatively, because his work ethic was through the roof.
Sure.
So at this stage, like, if you learn anything about guys like that, the respect that you gain is tremendous. It's like,
Right.
man, like, look, yeah, I mean, apologize. It's like he doesn't care about whatever I thought as a 15-year-old or a 20-year-old or 25. It doesn't matter. But like the amount of respect that you have if you actually see what they do is mind-boggling.
Right. Well, so I think that this part. Yeah, it's kind of. I'm gonna go on a tangent for just a second here. In that 20 Christmas New Year's 2022, I'm in the Blue Mountains in Australia, and we go to this little kind of jazz event for New Year's Eve. My wife and I, and it was like a four-piece little jazz band. It's like a small kind of venue, like lovely dinner, blah blah blah
Sounds nice.
blah. Yeah, it was great. And the three of the guys, the little drummer guy, and somebody on the saxophone or whatever, and three of the guys
A
were
little,
were were I think comfortably in their 50s, 60s kind of
okay.
situation. And then this piano player looked like he was maybe 30 years old. He was like
Yeah.
noticeably young than the other guys, and he was really good. He was like good.
Yeah.
And it was interesting to me because they took
Side
a
note,
break. Yeah.
you're a good piano player. I'm going to
No,
say it. So I like
I'm not a
stop.
good
Don't.
piano
It
player,
doesn't
but
matter.
I'm a
To me,
competent
you're a
piano
good.
player. Okay,
Okay,
it's all
fine.
relative, right? Coming
Yeah.
back to what we were saying earlier, right? Like it's all relative. I mean, like I'm genuinely, and I'm not being humble when I say this. I'm not a good piano player. I'm a competent piano player. Um,
Okay.
I, but I went up and had a quick chat to him because they go on break. They play for an hour, or they stop for a little while. And I'm like, hey, I you're really good. I wish that I could. I play a little bit, but I wish that I could play like you. And he was like,
Yeah.
essentially, he was like, he kind of laughed. He's like, yeah, be careful what you wish for. It's a very different thing when you do it for a living. It's
Yeah.
it
It
kind of
is.
talked a little bit about how some of the joy of the playing. Like I think that if I could sit down on piano and play like that, I would feel this deep joy at it. And for him, it's work, right? And I think a lot of people disregard that for professional tennis players. I don't want to come across like we're sitting here fanboying about pro players, right? But there's just this part where I think people disregard what it really takes to be a professional athlete. Like if I was to be a professional piano player, the hours and hours and hours of practice you have to do every single day, whether or not you want to, right?
Yeah.
That it's not okay. It's great that you love playing tennis, and for anybody listening, and that's fantastic, right? And you maybe are excited to go. That's how I feel about golf. I'm excited to go out and get a chance to play golf again. But if I had to do it for 6 hours a day every single day, whether or not I felt like it, I'm I might not have the same relationship with the sport necessarily, and some people do.
Sure.
But there's a part where understanding just how much work that is, just how much work it is to day after day after day to wake up and it's like, okay, I'm going to go hit serves for an hour, and then I'm going to hit
Right.
cross court balls, and then I'm going to work on my transition game, and then I'm going to work on my volleys, and then I'm going to go home and eat a little bit, and then I'm going to go play a practice match. And it's like it's this just day after, and when you're in it and you're passionate about it, and the days when you're feeling motivated, it's a joy, right? But then we have to acknowledge that it is a ton of work. It's not, you're not just kind of playing a game for a living, right? I mean, you are in a sense. I don't want to discount that.
I
Um,
think I think if you want to criticize, um, players that are in the top 20 or whoever you see on TV, if you want to criticize anyone who's in the media, let's put it that way, okay? Because the media is not covering, guys that are 2000 in the world. It's just not happening. So if you want to criticize anyone that's in the media, then I think you also have to say like, well, I'm championing. Wow, how do I say the word I want to say here?
championing. That's a little
That
bit of an
one.
awkward one, but anyways, go on.
Yeah, it is a hard one for me. You need to sing the praises then of the guy that's 500, 600 and say like, well, they're so wonderful. You've got to have both sides of it, right? Because if you're actually saying like, hey man, if you make it to 700, then it's phenomenal. Then maybe you can say, hey, I've been cheering you all along from 700 to 500 to 300 to 100 to 50. And like you've been supported and everyone is just rooting for you. And there's very little negativity in your life. Like just go for it. The reality is when athletes develop, and once you get to that borderline of maybe I can do this professionally or not, almost everyone has to dedicate themselves fully to it, and their identity becomes that of an athlete. And if you don't meet other people's expectations outside of yourself, you get branded a failure. So every day, it's not just, oh, I have to do this for 6 or 8 hours every day, but it's the whole time I'm surrounded by people who are telling me I'm a failure whenever I'm not doing it like perfectly.
Right.
So it's
Or
like,
not,
who
maybe not
comes
even
to who?
surrounded, but you just, all it takes is a couple people in your life that react that way, right?
Yeah, but those are the people that surround you. It's like if you go to work
Yeah.
and you have a
I'm just
boss
saying, but you might
and
not be
he's
surrounded.
like,
It might not be that everybody in your life's really negative about it, but I'm just saying, like, having just one or two people in your life that react that way can be really hard
yeah, it
emotionally
can
to
be
handle.
devastating
You can have nine
for sure.
people that are super, super fans and really supportive and encouraging, and one person is not, and inevitably that voice is going to carry a
That voice
disproportionate
is
weight.
huge. Yeah. And it's just, I mean, imagine like you're writing an email at work and you put the comma in the wrong place. And it's like now you're a failure at life. It's
Yeah, that's a
like,
little bit how we treat professional athletes at times, right?
yeah,
Um,
I really think that's exactly how it is. And that's the part that they don't get. And this is why so many of them check out, right? They're like, I don't care what you think and I don't care about the criticism and I don't need to listen to you because it sounds like you're criticizing me over a comma. Right?
right.
Like it sounds like you're criticizing me over like you just don't understand what the priorities are at that level of expertise, and you
Sure.
don't understand the day to day. And so the criticisms that come in from the outside don't hold a whole lot of weight.
Well, they do hold weight. They maybe shouldn't, but they do. And look, I think that sometimes it might be a little bit more meaningful than having put a comma in the wrong place when we think about some of the things that professional athletes do or say or they get criticized for. But
Oh,
I
sure.
think that very few people go through their professional lives and never make mistakes in their careers
No,
of
nobody
any
does, right?
nature, and that makes it, I think, challenging to think about if you are trying to do this for a living, and that your mistakes get amplified in a way that most people will never experience in their lives. Um, that's obviously a challenging thing to deal with. But coming back to what we were saying earlier about this kind of emotional alignment, like these are all these pieces that have to come together if somebody's going to be successful. And I think one of the things that I find interesting is that when somebody is maybe noticeably far below the mean for a professional tennis player in any given area. Right?
Okay.
If they maybe have a big emotional misalignment with like a drive to play a certain way with that doesn't align with their skill set, for example, it's
Sure.
I feel like the people that actually make it to television, that make it to the top 50, top 20, they're usually outsized or well above the mean in a different area. So if you think about like
Oh yeah.
the physically technically gifted player who has emotional problems, they they're usually really physically and technically gifted and
Yeah.
developed, and that enough so that it offsets the emotional stuff sufficiently for them to still have a successful career. But then we also see people the other way, where I know you mentioned passing Brad Gilbert in the hole earlier. Uh,
Oh yeah.
that somebody who wasn't particularly physically or technically gifted, but
Well,
I mean, it's relative.
it's incredible shot tolerance. Like his brain was gifted.
Well, that's what I'm saying. But he was, he had this overcorrection in other
Right.
areas. But these are the areas that we. So this is what's interesting to me, right? Brad Gilbert is celebrated for his emotional
Right.
and tactical intelligence on a tennis court,
Right.
and he's extra. I should say, like the celebration is elevated because he acknowledges that he wasn't particularly physically or technically gifted, that he was below average in those areas. And so
Yeah.
people take the fact that he's below average in those areas and say, "Oh my God, look how great!" And it's
Right.
this thing where he gets put on a little bit of a pedestal. And it probably doesn't hurt that he wrote a book that was a good book, and
It's a great book for sure.
coached some players to success. And not just some players. I mean, Andre Agassi among them. But there's a part of it where we do that for Brad Gilbert because I think as a society we have a there. I think there's a way maybe to the average person that Brad Gilbert's journey of being physically and technically underwhelming, but overcoming that with attention to detail and hard work and grit and determination is
Celebrated. Yeah.
this story that we'd all love to be able to tell about ourselves because how many people are physically gifted in that rare way. That's a top 1% fraction of a percent, and so it's relatable in a way,
It's
right?
relatable. Yeah.
And we can choose to frame, and we're kind of taught to frame his strengths as choices,
Right.
right? And I think that's a big piece when we talk about all this, and I think this is important for people to think about for their own game is we frame what Brad Gilbert was naturally good at as though it was just a choice and a result of, well, he worked hard. But
Yeah.
then when we have your Nick Kyrgioses or your even I mean Monfils is an example to me because the way that he plays tennis doesn't align with his skill set by and large. I mean, you have
Yeah. Yeah.
somebody who had the
Yeah.
tools to play this beautiful blend of offense and defense,
Yeah.
but didn't.
I mean, this Gail's one of, if not the most powerful players of all time.
Oh, I think he's a generational athlete, um, but we we don't frame that as a choice, right? We criticize them as though they
Right.
made a bad choice or they couldn't help themselves. And I think there's a part of it for people where they maybe wish that they had that list. Maybe there's a part of it that's almost like an envy or jealousy piece where it's like, oh, if I had that much talent, I
Totally.
wouldn't waste it. But what is
Totally.
talent, right? Like if we're going to talk about talent as the physical ability to hit a tennis ball and not going to frame neurological and emotional tolerance for the rigors of professional tennis as a talent,
Right.
then we're not doing anybody justice. And I think very, very importantly for people at home, you're not doing yourself any justice because this is a framework that we look at tennis through
Right.
that doesn't set us up for success because then if you're that player who you feel like you lose matches you shouldn't because you're better than the other guy or girl or lady, um well I
Nice save. It's okay.
yeah, so if you're that person, right, then it's, well, I'm a choker,
Right.
and yes, you might be, this is one of these things, like you might be better technically than the other person, but it doesn't mean you're a better tennis player.
Yeah.
It especially doesn't mean that you're better at winning tennis matches. And I
Right.
think that's really, really important to separate those things out, because we look at what we think of as being a good tennis player and being a good tennis match winner.
Completely different. It's
They
so funny that you
shouldn't
say
be,
that.
but they are.
Well, well, look, I mean, it's funny you say that because sometimes players on the tour will see me working out with somebody that I'm working with, and they'll go like, "Oh wow, like you're like a real player," and I'm like, "Oh no, no, I'm not." But I might be able to hit more shots than you, specifically because I was never a real player in my like compared to these guys. Because
Yeah,
it's like, yeah, I learned how to hit a one-handed backhand and a two-handed backhand. I learned how to hit like all the serves. I learned how to hit trick shots and all sorts of crap. Uh, what I didn't do was practice like actually sticking to the patterns that I was developing for other people
right,
and spend. I mean, but no exaggeration. It's like I have almost no experience of actually going out and executing game plans that I would make for other people. And
right.
it's like, look, you just got to understand that there's a different mentality that's necessary for that. And the only reason that I can even talk about it is because I've done that maybe in other things that weren't tennis.
Hmm.
So I can see, oh, here were the glaring holes in my tennis. But like I'd be as far from maximizing my like the effectiveness of my shots as I mean, really anybody that I can imagine.
Well, so,
Um,
it brings up an interesting point, and I don't want to like divert too much, because there's another thought that I had related to what I was saying a second ago about um, kind of how we might judge ourselves through this lens. Um, but what you're saying, you don't have to be. Being a great player doesn't make you a great coach, and being a great coach doesn't make you a great player.
right.
I was having dinner last night with somebody who was a three-time Olympian in fencing,
Nice.
and they were telling
Not
me
bad.
about somebody who's widely regarded as the greatest fencer of all time in any discipline.
Mhm.
And he had actually fenced against this person when he was still competing when he was younger, and he was, and this is a he's a very proud man, and obviously, I mean, a three-time Olympian. Um, Fencer in a sport that takes fencing seriously, or in a country that takes fencing seriously. I mean, it's no joke, right? We're talking about somebody who
Sure.
was a top 20 fencer in the world, and he talks about this person like he was a god, like he was otherworldly in his ability as a fencer, that he was
Mhm.
untouchable, that just in every aspect of fencing, he just was unbelievably good. So
Right.
fast, so accurate, the tactics, the footwork, the spacing, the rhythm, everything. He just was untouchable. And yet he's a terrible coach, like a terrible coach. Because I think maybe
Could
there's
be.
a part where he's so gifted at his sport intuitively and inherently that he never necessarily had to understand it in a way that maybe somebody who had to develop differently, or develop more in a lot of ways, right? Had to maybe dive into the nuts and bolts of their sport. So I think
Well, for
it's
me, that's like John McEnroe.
right.
It's like we had like Nick Bollettieri had way more success as a coach than John McEnroe did. John McEnroe's got his name on an academy in New York to this day.
And
But
I've
there's
watched
a
Nick
re
Bollettieri coach in person, and I was not particularly
yeah.
overwhelmed, right?
No, but the point is like what he brought was discipline from his time in the military, and he
Sure.
brought a certain attitude towards things, and he
On
was
the
able to
hustle.
get yeah, he was able to get people to achieve things essentially without having good technical knowledge and without being able to play at a high level.
Right. Well, I
And then
mean,
you have like John McEnroe, one of the most talented guys of all time, who's kind of like, you know, just put the ball over there. It's so obvious.
what's one of the interesting things to me, and I don't even know that when you say like put the ball over there, one of the things that got me writing articles about tennis in the first place was listening to John McEnroe and some of his peers commentating 10 years ago,
Yeah,
or was it more than 10 years ago now, where I was listening to him commentate matches and and just they're saying things that were nonsensical to me as an actual
right.
tennis coach who's coaching matches, and thinking, why are you saying this player should do this or that, or that this should be happening? It's not how they're going to win this match.
Right.
And I felt like the conversation around the tactic side of tennis was underwhelming to me. But I don't want to lose this thread that I had about for people who are listening, this idea of what we consider to be talent in tennis versus choices,
Mhm.
that if we're framing kind of neurological tolerance for maybe staying in patterns and things like that, and emotional kind of tolerance for things, or I should say, we talk about kind of that risk tolerance piece, right? Like having a risk tolerance or a risk aversion that matches with your skill set. We frame those as choices, but the technical and physical piece we don't frame as choices, and then we I think misvalue them,
Right.
and then that gives us a framework with which that we can talk about, well, so and so is a nutcase, and so is, they waste, there's so much potential but they waste it. But it's like, well, but there's also the ability to say, okay, what, I'm going to hit 50 cross court backhand so this guy breaks down.
Yeah.
That's a talent too. Like, that's
Absolutely.
potential, and we undervalue it so much.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things for me that's so wonderful about tennis is basically how complex it is.
Right.
I mean, we have to do things in every direction and all sorts of movements. There's so many different coordinations. Um, the one of the upshots of that is that I think we're still at a point in the sort of evolution of the game where we're not explicit about a lot of these things. And
Right.
our conversation around the game is not, um, well, strictly speaking, it's not very accurate. I mean,
Well,
that's what it
maybe
comes down to.
I think it's really incomplete.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
maybe I think
That's
it's
a
the way
nicer way to put it. Yeah,
I
yeah,
prefer to,
yeah,
well, I think the way I would frame it is, it has inaccuracies because it's so incomplete,
yeah.
right?
That
We're
that's right.
still, it's a little bit the Moneyball thing, right? Like, we're still overvaluing certain things and undervaluing others when it comes to players and player evaluations, and kind of how we are defining potential and
Sure. Or
whatnot.
even looking at it or identifying, even
Sure.
making them a part of the conversation.
Well,
I mean,
so this is
that's
an interesting thing, right? Like, I mean, we think about, coming back to Sam. I talk about somebody who peaked at 40 in the college doubles rankings and is now 40 in the ATP rankings. Sam has natural talents that have allowed him to go from being that player that was 40 in college to 40 in the world, which is, I mean, I, that's a phenomenal accomplishment. That is an
yeah. I
absolutely
mean,
phenomenal accomplishment. But the thing about it is right. I mean, Sam has he's I think, and you can disagree because you know him better than I do, but you're talking about somebody who is has the talent to be organized, has the talent to be disciplined, and go out and just do the work every day, has the talent to communicate frequently and efficiently and clearly. And these are all skills that I think contribute to somebody being able to build a successful tennis career as a professional, that
mhm.
nobody's talking about.
Well, look, I'll tell you the story to validate what you're saying because when I agreed to sign on with him and bring him into the fold to work with us and do everything developing his game, he was just a year and a half or so out of college, maybe 2 years out of college.
Hmm?
And I sat down actually and spoke with his father, um, who was basically giving him a loan to say like, okay, you can try and play pro tennis because his college coach was a phenomenal doubles coach,
Hmm.
like world class, Ryan. And Ryan Redondo was pushing Sam, saying like, you need to go play on the tour because Ryan knew pro doubles because he was one of the great talents that we had in American tennis, and he knew this guy has potential. Um, but he wasn't the fastest or the strongest. He did not have a big game. I mean, his serve was way underpowered, even though he's tall. Um, he just wasn't the explosive athlete. It was like if you sent him to say like the NFL combine and like did all those tests and stuff on him, like
He's below average.
you're the
Yeah.
last guy. It's not below, it's no, but it's not like below. And he wouldn't argue with this. It's like he'd laugh because he's like, it's not that I was below average. It's that like I don't belong there. Okay. I mean,
Oh, you mean relative
the,
to NFL players? I was thinking below average in the world of tennis.
no, I mean, don't belong in the world of tennis. I mean, this is like he essentially got lucky to get introduced to Ryan, who saw potential in him and said, "I want that guy on my team." But he's a walk on. This is not like a Division 1 scholarship athlete. This is someone who like when it was time to go to college, no Division 1 program wanted him. Like D3 programs were turning him down. No exaggeration. Okay, like I went to Emory, which was a great D3 program, but like they turned him down. It's like, now he's top 40 in the world. It's like, come on. Um, but the point is, I sat down with his father, who was actually a proper athlete himself, and I laid out the pathway. And hey, this is where I think we can go. And when I started saying, I think he can be top 100 by this time and top 50 by this time, and then we get into the top 20, and we'll have to see how he reacts emotionally. His dad's looking at me like, dude, you're crazy, and there's lots of swear words that I couldn't use right now, or I maybe shouldn't, or just bleep them out or something later on. But like, we actually had those conversations, and basically, I mean, and Sam knows this. I mean, but his dad basically said, "Look, like, how's he going to do that? Like, he can't serve with those guys. He can't hit forehands or backhands. He can't like
Can't
how
run with
how
them. Yeah.
like how are you? How is he supposed to be competing with the guys I'm watching on TV? It's just like it's like he's evaluating me basically to see like I think you're full of crap. Like you're selling me a pipe dream.
Sure.
And but I flipped it around and said a lot of the things that you said. I said, look, like he can communicate with me honestly, right? And his
Yeah.
dad's like, well, okay, yeah. And I'm like, no, but like, really think about it. Like, he will be actually honest with me and actually tell me how he feels. He won't hide it from me because he's not afraid of his feelings, right? So his dad thinks about it in a meaningful way. And he's like, yes, he will actually do that. And I said, okay. It's one of the hardest things to get a top 100 pro to do because they're
Right.
protective of their feelings. They don't want to share it. They don't want to tell you what their insecurity is. They don't want to expose those things because
Well,
all
they
they've
don't
done their
even
whole life is
understand
win.
it about themselves, right? I mean, it's one thing to
Absolutely.
be able to communicate it when you understand it, but you might not even know it about yourself to be able to
That's
communicate it. It's
that's where it's a skill.
self-awareness.
That's where it's like again, self-awareness is the skill, right? So it's like, look, he can communicate with me honestly. And then his father has a massive work ethic. And I asked him, I said, okay, so how's your son's work ethic? Because it seems pretty good. And he's like, his work ethic is good. I said, well, is he going to be able to outwork everyone? Because you tell me right now, if I'm wrong about his work ethic, you tell me because then this is not a good idea. He said, well, I don't question his work ethic ever. That's not going to be a problem. And it's like, great. Well, then I can teach him how to hit forehands and backhands and serves
That's yeah,
because like that's what we can do that. We know how to work with it. We can do the film. We can do all the stuff. We've spent our whole lives like we know physics. We know how to teach. I can teach a plant to hit a forehand, but like I can't teach anyone some of those other skills,
right.
right? So it's like if you're starting with that ability to say, I can outwork the world, okay, well, I'm not surprised to see you in the top 40. And in a very real way, I mean, we talked about it from day one. Like you have the skill and you need to value it just like you had the best serve in the world.
Right.
Because it might actually be more important. It might actually be more powerful, which is
Well, then,
crazy to think about.
yeah, but I think in a lot of ways, if and I think this is an important piece too, though, right? Is that if you have access to coaching that will help you develop a high level serve, then the
Yeah,
skill of doing the work and being able to organize your life in a way that lets you do the work
right.
is really, really, really important.
Yep.
But if you don't have access to a coach who can do that for you, then
Well, then, yeah, you better just
that,
be born with a serve.
right, you better be born with a serve. And so
You
like
better be
there's
born with a shoulder that moves real fast.
yeah,
Sure.
and can do it not just can move real fast, but then can do it sustainably. Because we
Yeah, without breaking.
we've seen shoulders on the tour that were capable of, and not just shoulders, I guess really is a lot of times I think it's that we see hips that are capable of generating this massive power and shoulders that are not capable of withstanding those
Sustain it.
forces in serving movements emotions,
Yep.
um, and that's no small thing. So yeah, it's funny to me. Like we just there's so many pieces that have to come together for somebody to have a successful professional tennis career. But
It's wild.
when we think about for amateur players or college players or people who are thinking about making uh, a run at being professional, you have to understand yourself enough, I think, to understand, and I think acknowledging maybe that I have an emotional drive to play tennis a certain way,
Right.
right? And understanding why that is, because if I'm playing good tennis, that is like controlled aggression, and I'm calling myself a pansy out loud because it's not aggressive enough, who am I trying to impress, right?
Yeah. Or what's
Like,
going on?
is this
Because
am I trying to show my dad what a big strong man I am, or you know what
right.
I'm saying? Like, what's going on that's driving that way of perceiving yourself or your own actions, and a, a lot of people, it's like, well, you don't need a coach and your therapist, right?
Yeah.
Really, uh,
Yeah.
to understand better, like some of these things that are driving you to behave a certain way on a tennis court, or try to play a certain way, and if you're not able to, one, be aware of it yourself, and then two, do the emotional labor involved in that, then you're not going to reach your potential as a player, or
Well,
even
look,
maybe come close to it.
I see you do that all the time. You use tennis that someone goes out and plays as a window for them to develop more self-awareness, and they see essentially the things that they're struggling with show up in their tennis game. And so then it's one of the things that's so cool about playing tennis and about the sport and about like working on your tennis game is like for me to get better at tennis, essentially I just become a better person. Like
Right,
I get my life more organized the way that I want it and I win more tennis matches.
right. Yeah,
I'd
yeah. Well,
be
that's the
I'd
thing.
be like if I'm more true to myself, like if I'm not like if I use better language to myself, it's like, well, I recover faster in between points, I win more points, I win more tennis matches.
Right,
So it's like it's not just like, oh well, I got my forehand better, but it's like, okay, but what was the work that it took to get your forehand better? It actually doing those things improves your life. And like the tennis is actually just it's like the tennis is just the tennis.
well, that's the thing. I think one of the things that really attracted me about being a college tennis coach. I mean, there's a part of it where, look, I mean, I love the game, and I loved, I think, figuring out how to make a team great. And I
Yeah.
loved the tactics of it all, and getting six singles player, every one of whom was different, and figuring out, well, what's the ideal way for this person to play, and this person to play, and this person to play, and not just that, but in this specific match, and juggling
Yeah.
all of that because you've got six matches going on at once, and you're trying to figure out the dynamic in six matches of, well, we're losing that one because of this, and we're winning that one because of this, and knowing
A
how
lot of
to
complexity.
intercede. It's got, the complexity was very attractive to me. I think I really enjoyed the challenge of that, and the
Yeah.
idea of, well, I think I could figure that out faster than the other coach could, right? If we think about, okay, assuming that we've got two teams that are roughly equivalent in strength, then
Right.
that's the game, right? Is that we've got these people that are playing matches, and they're trying to, they're competing against each other. In a sense, I'm competing against the other coaches. Can I get to where I need to be and say the
It's
thing?
funny. It's funny though that you say like two teams that are roughly equivalent in strength. You were always coaching teams that were absolutely lower strength competing against higher
Well, not
strength
all,
teams.
not always, and especially towards the later parts, right? But certainly in the early days, there was an element of that. But I lost my train of thought there. I was saying how, like, oh, that was one of the things that really kind of attracted me to college tennis in the first place. But I'd like to think I was pretty good at that, and obviously we had success doing that.
I mean, the results, I think, speak for themselves.
Sure.
But sure,
And so there's a part there where you do that for a little while, and you get in a routine of it, and you're good at it, but then you start to kind of lean more into the bigger picture stuff, and it's that part where I love tennis. Tennis is a sport, it's a game, and we're playing a game, you
yeah,
know, and using that as a vehicle to have this positive impact on people's lives is something that was really fulfilling. It's enriching, right? Like you add depth and value to being a coach in a
right.
way that gives it real meaning, because without that, what are we doing? You know,
Yeah.
what's the point of it all? You know what I'm saying?
Well, look, I mean, you know that I've got two. even younger kids than yours, right? My
Right.
my girls are 5 and 6 years old right now. Um, and it's funny how much it's like when they're that young and you deal with really little kids, it's so obviously about life lessons. And then we kind of lose that for a while, I think. But like when you're dealing with a 5-year-old, it's like, oh, you didn't like the way you hit that ball, or the shot didn't go where you want it to. It's all about you had expectations, they weren't met. Now, how do you respond? Right? Are you going to be respectful to the person on the other side? Like, are you actually competing? Are you being honest with yourself? Do you have a good attitude? All these things. And they really are more important. Like, you don't look at 5-year-olds and you're like, oh my gosh, like your backhand technique, like like, can you believe it? Like, your backhand technique is awful. You're a
Right.
failure at life, right? Which is like, so then
Well,
I
but
think
there
back
are
to my Andy
parents who do
Roddick.
that to their kids. To be
Okay,
clear,
but they're not going to be proud of that. But that's when I look back at my like the thoughts that I had in my head about like an Andy Roddick backhand when I was younger, and it's like, wow, like I mean, how far off was I? And and it's not like I'm not educated in general. It's like it's just it's very humbling where it's like, okay, so it's easy, I think, to say we all make those mistakes. But it's easy if you have really, really little kids. It's like, okay, well, let's just do some fundamentally good things. And then when they get older and when we get more like recreational level players, serious level players, it's easy to get lost in all the stuff of like, okay, but like which grip should I use, and like how should I use my wrist when I'm hitting my forehand, or like what should I do this for serve? And we could talk about all those things, right? Like you apply your physics theory to this stuff all the time. But like also a lot of the times it's a lot more, hey, like let's just get the fundamentals right, and then you're going to benefit in your game for sure, and you're going to benefit outside your game.
yeah, there's the piece of we can't just fix the way you hit a forehand if we're going to do this right. And this is true not just for college players. I mean, I have a gentleman here in Atlanta that I've worked with, and he's a member at one of the private clubs in town. And he came to me um, actually I think it was right before the pandemic started, or early days, relatively early days of the pandemic. And it was he really wanted to win his club championships, which he'd never
Yeah.
come close to doing before. And the interesting to me is like, yes, he got a lot better as a player. He improved his
Hmm.
serve and his forehand and his backhand and his volleys and all these little pieces and his understanding of how to construct a point. But the emotional labor that he did on learning how to be kind to himself in the context of tennis
Yeah.
and be
How cool
proud
is
of
that?
himself in the context of tennis, and watching that journey. And if he didn't go through that journey, and my hat's off. I mean, you're talking about somebody who's in his early 40s, right?
Yeah.
Who was willing to do that work and willing and able to have that conversation of,
Yeah.
hey, we're here in practice and we just changed the way that you hit a forehand and you're getting angry that you missed it. Like
Yeah.
what's the goal right now? What are we trying to accomplish? Is the goal to make the forehand, or is it to get better at hitting forehands? Right? Is it
Sure.
to learn how to hit it with this little grip adjustment or this backswing adjustment? Like let's right size this and understand what are
Yeah.
we actually trying to accomplish in this moment. But he was able to lean into that and engage in that and have also honest conversations about, well, why are you talking to yourself this way because you lost a point? Why are you getting so angry about having, not broken serve right here or getting your serve broken? What's going on? What is this really about? And
Right.
and evaluating his relationship with the sport, his relationship with himself in the lens of the sport, and did this massive emotional growth as a part of that. And I'm not putting this like, oh, I'm a therapist or anything like that, but it's really like
No,
he did this emotional
he
work.
did all the work.
Yeah, he
Yeah.
did all that work. I just asked questions and I, shown the spotlight of it and said like, hey, I think you need to
Right.
take a look at this. If you have this goal of wanting to win your club championships, but you're not going to win your club championship if you can't deal with this piece, because you
Yeah.
cannot play tennis this angrily and be successful. And then he was able to work on that and just get better and
Get
better and
better and
better
better
and
and better
better.
and better.
And then he won it. And
Yeah.
it
So
was
cool.
so cool to get the picture from him, get this text of him with this trophy, and he's won the championships for the first time in his life, and he's so happy about it. But then there's also this deeper part of like understanding he did it with, I think, and this is important, there's a joy in winning it with the relationship that he ended up with his game and himself and tennis, as
Right.
opposed to maybe a relief in winning it if he hadn't done that work.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's
Which
a
is
very
so cool.
different thing. Um, So yeah, I mean, kind of
This
we've
is this is maybe like the closing comment here, but I want to bring that and tie it into I think the pro tour out here because I'm in Melbourne and I'm in the Spirit, right? There's plenty of quotes you can find out there, but this is what I think when people are referring to when people like Novak or Roger talk about the game and they say like, oh, it's like 90% mental, right? Because
only
it's like
90% mental when all the other stuff's there. Like, I'm
yeah,
sorry,
I
but
always laugh at that. I'm like, yeah, dude, like Novak, like if you saw me hit a 400 backhand, you want to be like, oh yeah, 90% mental. You'd be like, well, you just, I mean, you got a lot of work to do. But the reality is when that relationship is good, right? If you have good alignment with what you're trying to do with yourself, then it allows you to do whatever work is necessary, right? So if we're judging ourselves and stopping ourselves from doing effective work, then it's like really hard to improve your mechanics, right?
mm,
But if you have a good sort of sense of how you should respond and react to things, I mean, I can say it about you because I've been seen for the outside for 20 years. Like you can help anybody hit the ball better
sure,
if if they can show up and do some work,
right.
right? And the people who aren't able to do it, it's either a physical limitation, right? A neurological limitation. Oh,
It's
hey
your
there.
thumbs up.
That's I think the thumbs up doesn't show up on the whole thing. I think just you saw it maybe. But like it's a physical limitation or a neurological limitation, or it's because they're stopping themselves actually from doing it. Um, but I mean almost exclusively like you can get through those things and do it. It's do you have the relationship with yourself to be able to like show up like a guy like Sam who didn't have any of the talent to begin with in theory, but he had the talent to
Well,
show up and work.
that's the
And
thing,
it's
right?
like,
He had the talent, obviously. It just
yeah,
wasn't the talent that most people think about. And I think if you're going to take anything away from today, it's one, be kind to yourself. Tennis is a really hard sport.
yeah,
It
yeah,
requires so
super.
much of us physically, technically, mentally, emotionally. So be kind to yourself, and I think make the space to get better too.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
so
And sort of what the question that I like to ask myself is what frame of mind do I have to be in order to do this thing that's hard?
mm. And then maybe what's stopping me from getting in that frame of mind? Like, what are the
Yeah, well,
obstacles?
that always opens up a whole Pandora's box.
Sure,
But the point is there's no doubt that it's fun to hit tennis balls. So it's like we run around and smack stuff like it's always a good time.
yeah,
But it's an even better time when I can slow down and ask myself, like, all right, well, where do I need to be to work on whatever I want to work on? Because I'm still improving in my 40s, and it just keeps getting better and better and more fun.
right.
Which, like, I never really would have thought in my 20s. I would have thought by now, like, what's the point? And now it's like, man, like, it's like the best part of my life. I mean, it's great.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I guess that'll be a good pausing point for a stopping point for now. Pausing point. We're going to do this again, so maybe
I
pausing
know.
point is the right way to say that. But doesn't mean pause the podcast. That means we're going to end this episode. We'll catch you next time.
We'll try to avoid the 4-year pause this time. Ciao, guys.
All right, mate. Bye.